So I'm so pleased to be speaking with you all today, and I've been really enjoying the presentations that have preceded me, and feeling somewhat of a kinship, because I think it seems that there's a lot of concern along the same sorts of lines across qualitative and quantitative topics. And I'm going to be focusing in my talk on some concerns around cookbook types of approaches to qualitative methods, and then present an alternate framework that's being proposed to sort of push beyond that cookbook style of thinking, and then focusing on an application within the classroom. So this is my goal in 20 minutes. So we'll see how it goes. So when you first start learning about qualitative methods in psychology, you're struck with how much variation there is, how many different types of methods there are. We have phenomenology and grounded theory and discourse analysis, and there are so many different methods and terms within each, and different epistemologies, different ways of thinking, different sets of procedures, different histories, different problems that the methods were designed to confront or deal with. They have different goals, right? Linda was talking about different epistemological foundations and different ways of evaluating what is successful in science. And those include things like hypothesis generation, concept clarification, consciousness raising, et cetera, right? So there's this strong, overwhelming sense of difference. That's very hard, I think, for students to negotiate and to try to figure out, well, how do I then proceed with methods? How do I then figure out how to design a study and move forward? And I'm thinking that this is part of the reason why we've moved towards, within qualitative approaches, which I think used to be taught much more conceptually, towards a more structuralist sort of approach, in which people are teaching more and condensing methods into more cookbook sorts of lists, like do step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3, this is step 4. You've done phenomenology, hooray, you're done. And often courses are taught either as surveys or sort of a single focused course on one method in qualitative approaches, but in both of those, there's this growing tendency for textbooks to teach using this sort of cookbook stance. There's advantages of this, right? So the advantages are it is so much more straightforward to learn. You don't have students who are pulling their hair out saying, well, tell me the answer. What should I do? How do I know? What do I do? They feel much more certain with these cookbook sorts of steps. They feel like they can replicate this independently when they go out and are publishing and reviewing work. Some journals have even developed little cheat sheet lists with these sorts of cookbook strategies associated with different qualitative methods for reviewers to glance at to assist them. And it's easier to learn language, right, with these cookbook texts. So there's these advantages of doing this. Let's see, where am I pointing? Okay. But there's also disadvantages, and clearly that's the concern of my talk. Qualitative researchers can apply these methods and learn these methods in a way so that they reify them, so that they think phenomenology has to include, or grounded theory, or discourse analysis, or content analysis has to include step 1, step 2, step 3, inflexibly, invariably, all the time, no matter what your question is, no matter what your goal is, no matter what your interest is, no matter what the characteristics of your phenomena are. So, I just completed a meta-method study of qualitative methods within the psychotherapy literature on clients, and found that even within qualitative research where there is this focus on talking about and thinking about epistemology, we rarely report investigators' epistemologies. So 20% of articles. And we even less rarely link our epistemologies to what we've actually done in our studies. Well, I think it was 15% or less of the articles in this data set of 109 studies that we reviewed. So there's a question of how can you appreciate that there are differences in procedures within different methods. Not all qualitative methods follow the same sets of procedures. But how do you recognize that these procedures may require adaptation, given your question, given your epistemology, given the characteristic of the phenomenon that you're studying? So With this concern in mind, we've been focusing on how do we articulate commonalities in qualitative methods. Well, there are some commonalities. We tend to focus on natural language, non-numerical forms of expression. We tend to focus on highly contextualized meanings and practices, often in reference to participants' personal meanings as well as cultural meanings. And we tend to centralize, our methods tend to centralize a circular series of inferences, which are self-correcting, and this iterative process. So we look at our data, we try to develop an understanding, we collect more data, we interpret that, we look at that understanding, and we see, does this new data correct that understanding? Does it shape that understanding? We adjust our understanding. We collect more data. We interpret our data now in light of that more data, and we continue on progressively improving and refining our understanding as we go on, hoping to have these gradual improvements. So the question then that I became very concerned with was, well, how do we understand what are these improvements? So if this is a process that cuts across qualitative methods. And here I'm going to be talking about methodological integrity for a little bit, which is a framework that we developed to try to capture the methodological basis of trustworthiness across different qualitative methods. And this is a more functionalist approach to thinking about rigor, thinking about trustworthiness in qualitative methods. And this is strengthened when the work researchers are doing is compatible with the goals that they have, with the epistemological positions that they have, and with the characteristics of the questions and the subject matter that they're looking at. So you're looking not just on the step-by-step procedures, but thinking conceptually about what are my goals, how do I approach this question in a way that considers the characteristics of my study question and phenomenon. We developed this framework of methodological integrity. This is a paper that came out recently in Qualitative Psychology in consultation with experts from across different qualitative methodological approaches and subjects. So we had, I think, 13 or so different experts provide feedback to us and help us shape this framework. And there are two central processes in this framework that I'll discuss here today. And first I'll give a brief definition, and then I'm going to move into talking more about how to teach these within a classroom context. Okay, I'll say more in a second. So the first being fidelity. And this is the process by which researchers seek to develop and maintain allegiance to the phenomena under study as it's conceived within their tradition of inquiry. So if I have a constructivist inquiry tradition, if I think that my construct is something like, well, I study LGBT issues, so if my construct is something like butch lesbians, it may be that I believe that this construct is something that's been generated interpersonally within groups of people over certain generations for different reasons, in different contexts. But I still am interested in having my results maintain allegiance to that construct as it's understood and as it's working within that community. So this proposition of fidelity doesn't assume necessarily a realistic framework of understanding. And there are 4 different components that I'll be talking about as I talk about teaching more: adequate data, perspective management, and data collection and analysis, and groundedness. And I'll provide more information on those momentarily. The second larger process is utility. And this is the process by which researchers select procedures to generate insightful findings that usefully answer their research questions. So you can see that these concepts of fidelity and utility are not, I don't think of them as uniquely qualitative concepts. I think that they extend into the ways we think of and evaluate quantitative research as well. But here we've articulated these with a particular focus on qualitative research. And our 4 components here are contextualization, catalyst for insight, coherence, and meaning contribution. So I've given you these 2 general concepts of fidelity and utility. And now I'm going to sort of switch over, so we'll see how this works, and talk about a teaching context. And so this is a qualitative class that I'm teaching at the graduate level. And what I've tried to do is to marry teaching about specific qualitative methods and their procedures with thinking about methodological integrity and the principles that underline the evaluation of those procedures together to enhance students' understanding of how to apply procedures and when to vary them and change them more flexibly given their questions and subject matter. So it's a sort of two-pronged teaching approach. About half of each of my classes is focused on lectures. So I have a series of lectures that are surveying different qualitative methods that are set up strategically to hit points that are happening in the second part of my class, which is an active research project. So my class works with me as an active research team, and we're collecting data, we're analyzing data. We end the class with a written manuscript that we continue on and we publish. So far out of the classes that I've completed, once we've completed the analysis, we've published all of the articles that have come from this class. And the students are all co-authors, which they are happy about and enjoy. So we're structuring the class so that as I talk about the different sorts of methods, I'm hitting on the activities in the project that those relate to. So when we're unitizing data, we're learning about phenomenology, and we talk about meaning units, and then they get to practice making meaning units. When we are learning about interviewing, they're doing their interviewing. We start off learning about theories and philosophies of science in the beginning, ethics, multicultural ethics, and we continue on through the class, and they're doing different sorts of activities in their project. They're learning about grounded theory as they're categorizing, and we continue on this way. We learn about how to write, how to present qualitative research, reporting standards, et cetera, as we're doing those activities. So, okay, so within this structure though, what I'm excited about is that the students are very actively engaged in a project, so they have the opportunity to think and wrestle with problems that emerge when you're actively involved in real research. So here, when we think about fidelity, is our phenomenon staying true, representing clearly the phenomenon we're studying? Fidelity is improved when the data can be collected from diverse sources that shed light upon phenomenon at hand. So here, we ask ourselves to think about this. What sorts of variability would we need given our specific phenomenon that we're studying? So instead of having sort of a cookbook approach where you have a set N and we say, well, you need to get a certain number of participants. Or instead of having an approach where we say, well, we're just going to think about diversity includes these populations. We're going to get a certain number of people from each of these populations, and we've covered diversity, we're done. We sit and we talk about what is the subject we're focusing on. And I've done a whole variety of different subjects in this class. This year we're focusing on the idea of cultural empathy. So we think about this. What is cultural empathy? What sorts of variations in people's experiences would you need to have a full picture of what cultural empathy could look like? And we talk about it, and the students wrestle with it, and they have different opinions. And in this process, they're learning not just about sampling, but they're learning about thinking about how do you sample in relation to a specific question. Perspective management in data collection. So here, this is the idea that fidelity is improved when investigators recognize and are transparent about their perspectives and how their perspectives influence their data collection, and work to limit that. So we start off in the first class with all the students memoing and writing down their presuppositions, their expectations, and thinking about how they need to be cautious about those. And we talk with each other about those, so we reveal them to each other. 2 minutes, okay. And we continue on. Perspective management, so in data analysis, we continue on our analysis. They're working in teams, they're questioning each other. If I interpret data one way, how does my fellow students see that? They're checking each other and they're noticing how they interpret things differently and coming to wrestle with this. I'll give you an example of utility, contextualization. So utility is improved when findings are presented in their appropriate context. And So they wrestle with this in terms of thinking through, are we presenting the context within our category labels? Are we representing our context within our write-up? Are we presenting this, are the limits of our context within our limitation section? So wrestling with these sorts of ideas, always with our subject in mind. I'll move forward. So I've written a paper on this teaching approach, which flashed earlier on the slides that people can reference if they're interested. But the disadvantages of this teaching approach are that it is heavy workload for the instructor because you're giving students feedback. The students are doing these interviews, but you're reading all of their interviews, giving them feedback, reading all of their reading units, giving them feedback, reading all of their categories, giving them feedback in real time as the class progresses. So it's very heavy teach load. And because of that, it's hard to do with a very large class. It's also somewhat unpredictable because real things happen in research. So you have students whose participants don't show up for their interview and they have to reschedule, or the software computer crashes or something happens. And so we set the class up that way in the beginning. But the advantages are that it's an experiential learning process. The students are wrestling with making decisions, and we're talking about the decisions in the classroom, talking about why different sorts of rules that seem to be rules should be flexible or should be changed. The students get incredibly invested because I encourage them to think of themselves as advocates for their participant in the analysis. And so they get quite invested. And they check each other's interpretations through the class. So this is, in terms of thinking about reliability, an interesting process. And then we end up with a real contribution towards knowledge in the forms of a paper. In addition to teaching procedures, this is my last slide here, the focus on methodological integrity within the classroom can help them think more consciously about what they're doing as we're doing all these adaptations. It can help them conceptualize and articulate how methods need to be adapted and why they shouldn't be fixed and this cookbook approach can't work. And help them understand processes that also cross qualitative methods better. We see how the ideas that we were talking about when we learned about phenomenology bleed into those when we talk about grounded theory, discourse analysis, et cetera, and help students better appreciate the complexity of research design. Thank you. Sorry.
Any others before mine?
Yes.
Do you find that students differ very much in terms of their propensity to be good at these kinds of methods versus quantitative methods? How do you feel about the talent pool in one direction?
I think that there's a self-selection process because the certain students select to take my course, right? So they're interested in the course. They're usually highly invested when they come in. The other thing that happens is because they work in groups, they support each other. So one person might have more conceptual strengths for coding, and one person might have a more focused precision orientation in terms of unitizing. They support each other. And then I'm also giving them feedback almost immediately when they do something. And so they, I think it's a little bit challenging for them because I think graduate students sometimes aren't as used to being corrected, and they're being corrected continually in my course. And we talk about how that is a good thing. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
I just want to make this comment that I was struck, especially in your talk, with a theme that seems to be coming up over and over again, and that's that both in the quantitative and the qualitative paradigms, we want to teach students to think carefully about their analyses and not just give them a cookbook recipe of here's how you do it, here are the steps. And we're constantly struggling against that because it seems like it's a lot easier to do that, and that's what people seem to want.
Yes. Yes, yes. I think that's happening also in, I mean, I know my experience has been, you know, having my work reviewed especially, I can see a difference where in the beginning I would get these incredibly thoughtful reviews, and then it moved into getting these very cookbook checklist reviews. You did this, you didn't do this. Or why did you not do, you didn't do this, so it must be bad because you have to do this method. And then I would have to argue back. And I think, you know, part of the work that myself and my colleagues are doing is to try to communicate other ways of thinking about research methods and to try to develop standards and guidelines to sort of facilitate that alternate form of thinking.
Another theme that has been passing through all of these that I'd like to note, I think we saw it especially with Bill Levitt and Pascal Levitt and Heidi's presentation, but other places as well, is that being a good teacher takes really hard work. But let's reframe that. Being a good teacher takes a lot of deep commitment, and it's very much the same thing. So let's see, one other part of being a student takes hard work too. Yeah, Scott, finish it off.
Just a brief comment is that the three of us have not coordinated. We know each other well over the years. With Linda doing discourse analysis and Heidi ground theory of economic with each one of us in some way pointed that we had to do philosophy and qualitative research together in the same course. We tried to separate it with my school into a separate course on philosophy and then on qualitative. It works much better when you're bringing up philosophical issues and dialogue research and vice versa. And I found a way of accomplishing that in the course of the structure of the semester and against the countless two courses. Dividing the course into a Monday, Friday type of situation, 2 hours of lecture on theory for the whole class, you can have 30 or 40, and then you divide into smaller groups on the other days, and then you them to individual research projects, putting into practice in the practical classes the theory that they're learning in the theory, and doing both at the same time pedagogically works better than separating them. And I wonder if also, with your experience in the quantitative, if you bring philosophy to science in any way, or does that stay separate? But with qualitative research, doing philosophy and the practical applications together is important.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you.